It usually doesn't.
Facebook streams instantly, and YouTube will just sit here and just not want to start streaming. Here we go. Okay. We're back in Zechariah. We're still in chapter 1, and we're finally getting into the visions. And we're going to cover the first two tonight, and then, I don't really, this comes as no surprise to anyone. I don't plan in advance for this, so I don't really know how we're going to break this up going forward, if we're just going to do a chapter a week like we've been doing up until now, or if we're going to try to take some of these shorter chapters and double up on them. I don't really know. But for tonight, we're just going to finish out chapter 1, which is the first two visions. So if you remember last week, it had sort of the introduction and then a little almost mini sermon from Zechariah. And so now we get into the visions beginning in verse 7 of chapter 1. On the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shabbat in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo the prophet. I saw by night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse, and it stood among the myrtle trees in the hollow. And behind him were horses, red, sorrel, and white. And I said, My Lord, what are these? So the angel who talked with me said to me, I will show you what they are. And the man who stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are the ones whom the Lord has sent to walk to and fro throughout the earth. So they answered the angel of the Lord, who stood among the myrtle trees, and said, We have walked to and fro throughout the earth, and behold, all the earth is resting quietly. Then the angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which you were angry these 70 years? And the Lord answered the angel who talked to me with good and comforting words. So the angel who spoke with me said to me, Proclaim, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I am zealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with great zeal. I am exceedingly angry with the nations at ease, for I was a little angry, and they helped, but with evil intent. Therefore thus says the Lord, I am returning to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, says the Lord of hosts, and a surveyor's line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. Again proclaim, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, My city shall again spread out through prosperity. The Lord will again comfort Zion, and will again choose Jerusalem. Okay, so that was a lot. And I mean, comparing this to the second vision that we're going to get into, this was kind of long. But anyway, so I guess before we get specifically about talking about this vision, sort of just talk about the visions in general. So do the visions fit together, and are they authentic, right? So pretty much everyone agrees that these visions do go together in the book. They're all, originally supposed to be grouped together in the book. But there is some disagreement about their overall unity, thematically at least, and how they sort of fit together. So, right, there's a total of 8 visions. You have horses, horns, a measuring line, a high priest, a lampstand, and olive trees, fine scroll, a woman in a basket, 4 chariots. And, there have been a lot of different ways that people have tried to divide these up thematically and figure out what's the continuity stringing these 8 visions together. So I'll just kind of run through a couple different ways that people have tried to put these together. So used to, they were divided by subject matter into 3 groups. So you had the first 3 visions about the return from exile, the next 2 about the anointed of God, and then the last 3 about the removal of sin. And then later on, they said, no, it's not really 3 groups. It's divided into 2 groups. And so you have 3 visions, although not the first 3. It's visions 1, visions 2, and visions 8, which deal with Israel's relation to the other pagan nations that surrounded it. And then the other 5 visions deal with Israel's future. Then even still, there's been debate about how the first and the eighth visions are connected, and then 2 and 3, 4, 5, and 6 and 7 are connected, which takes us not 2 or 3 groups, but 4 groups of visions. So, and then even the visions themselves, right? Even if we're not worried about okay, how are these sort of connected to each other? Even just the visions themselves have been questioned as to whether or not Zechariah actually saw these visions or he was merely using them for literary or liturgical purposes. So, did he actually see these visions, or is he just sort of borrowing vision language in order to make a literary point, or, these were used later as points of meditation. So there's also that. However, it's best to think that while Zechariah does use a lot of motifs and traditions of other writings, even non-biblical writings within his own work, this doesn't take away from the authenticity of God's message given to Zechariah and the vision that message was given through. There's a whole side of scholarship that agrees that Zechariah does sort of borrow from other vision work both in the Bible and outside of the Bible, but acknowledges the authenticity of the vision itself. So all this is to say, I guess, to answer the two questions at the top, despite not knowing exactly how the visions fit together, right? Which visions are connected, which visions, where do we exactly divide the visions? Despite not knowing exactly how they fit together, we do know that they do fit together, and everyone agrees on this. Similarly, while we don't know exactly what Zechariah experienced, because that's the thing about a vision. It's you'll have a dude that's I was laying in bed and then I had a vision and I was in another place. Well, if it's a vision, were you actually in another place, or were you just envisioning that you were in another place? That's kind of the thing about a vision, is it's weird. So we don't know exactly what Zechariah experienced, but we do know that he did experience genuine revelation from God in the form of a vision. However that played out, we don't exactly know. I don't think at least anyone in here has had a vision from God. If you did, tell me about it, because that's kind of weird and interesting. I don't know that I'll believe you, but I still want to hear about it. But anyway, so yeah, the visions do fit together. We don't exactly know how, but they do, and they are authentic visions from the Lord. So then we have the date, the location, and the theme for the visions. So the date that we're giving for seemingly all of the visions is the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month of Shebat, in the second year of Darius. And I mentioned last week that this doesn't necessarily mean that this applies for all of the visions. It doesn't necessarily mean that the visions are successive, although that is how it's been interpreted, and that is a way to interpret it. But they didn't necessarily all occur in the same night. We just don't really know. The location of the first vision is sort of, one commentator just wrote, it's impossible to determine, which is pretty true. And it sounds like something that's occurring at the temple, mainly because of what verse is it? Verse 8, he stood among the myrtle trees in the hollow. And so people will try to point out, this is the courtyard of the temple. So it sounds like, this is occurring at the temple, although the temple hadn't actually been rebuilt yet. So there's that. The temple imagery is likely being imposed onto a vision occurring in heaven. So, and evidence for this is found, not only within Vision 1, but the later visions as well. So, right, in Vision 1, you have, these horse patrolmen, and they say, "We have walked to and fro throughout the earth, and behold, all the earth is restless." And we know that, to some extent, these are not just regular dudes. These are, angels, sort of heavenly beings to some extent. And so, right, this has been compared to the description of Satan and Job, Job gets into a lot of the heavenly council, as we would call it, and sort of, what goes on behind the scenes. And the description of Satan, by his own admission, is he was roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Sounds pretty similar to what we just read about these horsemen. And that's not to say that the horsemen are Satan. I'm just saying, we're dealing with, this is probably taking place in heaven, and we're probably dealing with the heavenly council, that kind of a thing. The date, we're only really given a date for the first vision, and then that could possibly apply to all of them, possibly not. The location, at least for the first vision, is probably not the temple. It would probably be temple imagery superimposed on heaven, which you see a lot of that in Revelation also. And then the theme for the vision. So thematically, Zechariah is being identified as sort of a night watchman. And you see this elsewhere with the prophets. Habakkuk, Ezekiel, Isaiah are all sort of compared to night watchmen. And the nighttime is identified with distress, not just here, but elsewhere in the Bible. It's identified with distress, and the daytime's identified with deliverance. And so it's been argued that the 8 visions are structured as the phases of the night, right? Ultimately culminating in morning, deliverance, and restoration. That's another argument as to how these visions should be structured. Is that how it's actually supposed to be read? We don't know, but it's kind of interesting. But thematically, right, Zechariah is sort of a watchman who gets an inside look into, sort of the heavenly council and, God dealing with Judah and Jerusalem. So anyway, now we're kind of narrowed down and we're thinking specifically about the first vision that we just read, and we want to sort of identify some stuff that we're not too concerned about. So what isn't of concern? Well, first of all, there is an interpreting angel in these visions. And people will say, oh, an interpreting angel, this must be apocalyptic. This is the book of Daniel has interpreting angels, and that's all about the end times and stuff. Not necessarily, right? Just because there's an interpreting angel doesn't necessarily mean that these visions are apocalyptic in nature. Second, right, more specific to this vision, there's colors assigned to the horses. The colors really hold no significance at all. If you ever read some dude and he tries to assign significance to the colors, be leery, because almost no one does that, because there really isn't any. Additionally, the number of horses isn't really significant, and you can't even really know the full number of horses, because all we're given, it's called the vision of 4 horses, but you have, I saw by night, verse 8, a man riding on a red horse, and then behind him were horses of red, sorrel, and white. So that makes 4, but that only describes one guy and what's behind him, not necessarily, for all we know, there could be a lot of other horses. So there's not really any significance in the angel, the interpreting angel, that is. There's also the angel of the Lord, which is separate. That's pretty significant. But the interpreting angel doesn't hold a lot of significance. The colors of the horses, not significant. And the number of horses are also not significant. So we're not going to try to, analogize any of that, because there's just not really anything there. So the message of the first vision, what is the overall message? With all that stuff out of the way, we can kind of dig into the vision itself and hopefully understand it. So, right, first off, what kind of message are we dealing with here? Because, as I like to say, when it comes to the minor prophets, we're no strangers to biblical depression. And a lot of the time it's destruction and, judgment for sinners and all this stuff. But it's kind of funny, because this is actually a message of encouragement. And yeah, you might not pick up on that, because the angel of the Lord in verse 12 is lamenting, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah? But it's actually a message of encouragement. And you can see that by the time you get to verse 17. The point of the message is very much encouragement. And that's sort of what's interesting about these is sort of, right out of the gate with these 8 visions, we're already getting encouragement. And usually in the minor prophets, it's all death, doom, and destruction. And then tacked on the last 2 verses is hope. So that is kind of interesting. God is zealous for Jerusalem and zealous for Zion, and he's exceedingly angry with the nations at ease. And he even says that, he's going to return to Jerusalem with mercy, and my city shall again spread through prosperity. So the main message of the first vision is definitely one of encouragement for Jerusalem and Judah anyway, not so much the nations at ease. So then we have the characters of the vision. And I gave you 3 blanks. I'm going to give you 5. Don't start writing, but I'm going to give you 5. You got a man on a red horse from verse 8. Also in verse 8, you have other horses, presumably with other, heavenly angelic riders. In verse 9, you have an interpreting angel. In verse 10, you had the man who stood among the myrtle trees. And in verse 11, you had the angel of the Lord. So that was 5. And like I said, don't start writing anything down yet, because we're going to sort of narrow that down a little bit. The man on a horse, the man among the myrtle trees, and the angel of the Lord are likely the same person, right? It's likely the same character. You have the man on a horse and the man among the trees, and there's no mention of a horse with the man among the trees in verse 10. It's probably the same person. And then you also, have the angel of the Lord who stands among the myrtle trees, which is, again, likely the same person. So really, we can narrow this down to 1, you have a man on a horse / a man among the myrtle trees / the angel of the Lord. Why he didn't just give him one title, we don't know. But you have that. And 2, you have other angelic horse riders. And then 3, you have an interpreting angel. So you have, the man on the red horse, who's also among the myrtles, and is also the angel of the Lord. You have other horse riders, and you have an interpreting angel. And that's pretty much the characters of Vision 1. So then we get into, okay, what is actually of concern? What is some significant things in this vision that are, not just pointless, and we would actually get something out of it. And it might seem weird for this not to be placed immediately after the section where I talked about, well, what's not of concern. But, I really structured this as okay, here's the stuff we're not going to deal with. And then, let's talk about the characters, because obviously we're going to deal with them. And then, okay, what's the symbolic stuff that we're going to deal with. So anyway, what is of concern in the first vision? You only got 2 things, really. Number 1, 70 years. This has been called the night of waiting, right? In other words, these angelic riders have been going to and fro throughout the earth for 70 years. 70 years literally, 70 years symbolically. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. We're not hung up on that. But it is significant. You have these 70 years, this night of waiting, that these angels have been going to and fro throughout the earth. And obviously we know that this number occurs elsewhere in the Old Testament. And it has various meanings assigned to it. Is this a specific, knowable period of time? People would like to say yes, but there's so many different people who say yes and then give different answers that really the answer is no. Yeah, we don't know. Is this the Babylonian captivity? Is this symbolic for the overall just decline of Jerusalem? We don't know. It's just, what's of interest is that, this is identified with, the present in which, God is, as the angel says in verse 12, not having mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, and against which you were angry these 70 years, right? So what's interesting is the 70 years thing even pops up in extra biblical sources, right? I think this is from Babylon. I didn't if I'm writing a paper, you got to put footnotes. I didn't footnote this. I'm not turning this in for a grade. I just wrote this down and I didn't put where this is from. I think this was from Babylon. Basically, there was a god and, false god, obviously. And, Babylon, I guess, wasn't pleasing the god. And it's like, all right, I'm going to punish you for 70 years. And it lasted 9 or 11 years. And then the god's like, all right, you're done. But it's still recorded in, Babylonian myth is like a 70-year judgment, because the 70 years is basically just a stand-in for, a city or a temple or place that, the god is angry at and is punishing. So, yeah, we shouldn't, read too much in the 70 years and try to figure out, when exactly is the 70 years on a map. But, this is that God has been in the past and apparently still currently is for Zechariah angry against Jerusalem and Judah. And that's pretty significant. The second thing that's of concern is, again, just the word again. And it's found 4 times in verse 17. And there's some debate about how the word functions specifically in the second instance, right? So I'll reread verse 17. Again, first instance, proclaim, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, my city shall again, second instance, spread out through prosperity. The Lord will again, third instance, comfort Zion, and will again, fourth instance, choose Jerusalem. So you have 4 instances of the word again, all within the same verse. And what's interesting is the second instance, the phrase, my city shall again spread out through prosperity. The word again can also mean while. And, there's really no debate about 1, 3, and 4. It's pretty much everyone's like, yeah, that just means again. The second one, there's some debate. And it can basically be translated, while my cities are scattered or deprived from the good. In which case, if instance 2 should actually be translated as while, then the emphasis is on the present reality of Jerusalem, in which they are deprived from the good, right? So you see the difference is, you read the New King James, and I didn't check other translations, but my city shall again spread out through prosperity. So the emphasis there is on the future. Again, in the future, my city shall spread out through prosperity. If it's while, then the emphasis is on the present. While my cities presently are scattered the good or deprived from the good, right? In order to draw a contrast between the present and then the future of instances 3 and 4, in which the Lord will comfort Zion in the future and the Lord will choose Jerusalem in the future. But nonetheless, the fact that is sort of God's answer to the question, right? The angel, this is verse 12, the angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which you were angry these 70 years? And then in verse 17, the answer is basically, he doesn't actually technically answer the question of how long. He doesn't say, just give it another 70 years and then it'll be fine. But he does promise. He says, the Lord will again comfort Zion and will again choose Jerusalem. And that's significant. So anyway, sort of putting all of this together, putting the first vision together. Number one, the main message is one of encouragement, right? This is primarily a message of hope and encouragement. Even though Jerusalem is currently in a period of distress, right? How long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah? Jerusalem will once again be chosen by God and will once again be comforted by God. And so it's very much a message of encouragement. And then secondly, we have a man on a horse, a man among the myrtles, and the angel of the Lord, and we argued that's the same person. And this leads sort of an unknown number of angelic patrolmen that go to and fro throughout the earth. So number 2 is regarding these heavenly night watchmen, so to speak. Zechariah is allowed to see how they operate, as well as to see, not only the present suffering, but also to see the future hope. And that's pretty significant for anyone, right? I mean, for anyone to get to do that is pretty significant. So, all right. Any questions on the first vision or comments or anything?
No, that word again doesn't show up in my Bible.
What does yours say?
It says, "Cry yet, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, my cities through prosperity shall yet be spread abroad, and the Lord shall yet come from Zion, and shall yet choose Jerusalem."
Yeah, so basically it's just picking up on the fact that it's future. So yet. Same, yeah. I mean, just basically translating the.
So yet would be again.
Basically, yeah. Different English translation of the Hebrew word. And yeah, picking up like, the Lord will yet do this. I mean, that's, in English, that would be a way of expressing something happening in the future. So that's actually, in a way, good. In a way, not so good, because assuming that they chose that specifically in order to emphasize the future, that's good, unless you take that the second instance is actually referencing the present, in which case it's not so good. But that is interesting, though. And that does give insight into, again, the contrast between the present distress and the 70 years of God's anger, but yet God will do XYZ. So anyway. All right. 18 through 21 is the vision of the horns, and I'll start reading that. Let everyone flip the page. I guess I should flip my page too. That might be helpful. All right. Verse 18. Then I raised my eyes and looked, and there were 4 horns. I said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these?" So he answered me, "These are the horns that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." And the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen. And I said, "What are these coming to do?" So he said, "These are the horns that scattered Judah, so that no one could lift up his head. But the craftsmen are coming to terrify them, to cast out the horns of the nations that lifted up their horn against the land of Judah, to scatter it." So yeah, pretty short. Hopefully self-explanatory. I mean, it's never going to be like completely self-explanatory, because we got horns and symbolic stuff, but I think this is one of the easier ones, in my opinion. So the message of the vision, while in the present Judah and Jerusalem are scattered, there's coming a day in which those who have scattered Judah will be cast out themselves. So yeah, feel free to paraphrase that however you want to. That was pretty long, but basically, in the present, Judah's scattered. In the future, the scatterers will be scattered. And again, feel free to make that better grammar. But anyway, and thematically, this actually makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more when we get into the what is of concern section. But anyway, so yeah, once again, what isn't of concern? What's sort of off the table? We're not really worried about this. There isn't a lot of symbolism here, that kind of thing. The number of horns. The fact that there's 4 horns is probably just linking this to the 4 horses of the first vision, and is also probably symbolic that every nation that has gone too far in punishing Judah would be dealt with by God. It's probably symbolic of total destruction, that kind of thing. So the number of horns, and then also the identities behind the horns, aren't really all that important, right? I mean, yeah, you can pretty much guess Babylon is probably one of them, and whatever, Syria or whoever. But yeah, we're not really concerned about that. So what is of concern, right? What can we actually get out of this? Why the horns are being punished? That's pretty significant, and it actually again links back to Vision 1. So the first vision showcased God's anger against Judah in verse 12. And here we have an expanded section about God's anger against the nations. But it was actually first mentioned in verse 15 from the first vision. So verse 15 says, I'm exceedingly angry with the nations at ease, for I was a little angry, and they helped, but with evil intent. All right, so apparently these nations, these horns, are being punished for helping with evil intent, or an independent translation is, furthering the disaster. And basically, God, as we've talked about, in other minor prophet books, used, other nations to punish Judah. And, but at the same time, right, these nations went too far. And, we're not to necessarily take out of that, like, God, spoke to the commander of the Babylonian army, or like, drew on a rock and said, okay, here's exactly how much gold you can plunder from the temple, and here's exactly, how many houses you can burn. But I mean, yeah, it's basically God allowed Babylon to, sack Jerusalem, and, I guess the ethics of war back then were not, they were not playing by the Geneva Convention of, the 6th century BC. And so God said, okay, yeah, I acknowledge that, and I'm going to punish them for that. So, right, they're being punished for, helping with evil intent or furthering the disaster, basically going too far in, punishing Judah. Second thing that's of concern is the metaphor of the horns, right? We're not concerned about like analogizing the number of the horns or trying to figure out, who do the horns represent, but the metaphor of the horns can actually be pretty significant. Psalm 75:10 gives insight into this metaphor, and it says, all the horns of the wicked I will also cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be exalted. So when bulls were captured, right, their horns would be cut off. And God is essentially, if you believe that this is sort of the metaphor that's being used here, I will add that, because the very next point is sort of a different metaphor that would conflict with this. But if you believe that this is a metaphor of like bull horns, then what's at play here basically is God is capturing these foreign nations who went too far in their destruction of Judah. And just as you would capture a bull and cut off its horns, God's capturing these nations and just judging them, and however that played out, death by the sword, death by famine, death by drought, fill in the blank. So then, thirdly, we have the craftsman. And this is basically another way to interpret the metaphor, not as being a metaphor of, bull horns, but iron horns. So, and this is kind of, it can go in both categories as sort of something that isn't of concern and is of concern, because we're not concerned with like who the craftsmen are or, that kind of thing, but there might be some symbolism in how they operate. So, for example, craftsmen or smiths, who were familiar with metal would know how to cut down horns, especially iron horns. And Micah 4:3, which thankfully I thought to bookmark before I got here, 4:13. Sorry, Micah 4:13. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. Now, it's significant because you have a nation being compared to a horn of iron. Obviously, that nation would be Judah, so the analogy kind of breaks down. But, if you take, okay, well, maybe that's what this is getting at. And maybe this is sort of like Micah, and this is like a horn of iron kind of thing. And then you have these craftsmen who would deal with metal, who would know how to cut down horns of iron, right? So you could see, kind of how that would work is, If you, oh, well, this is like a bullhorn, then, oh, well, God says, I'm going to like, cut off the horns of people and, that kind of thing. If it's a horn of iron, then, you have these craftsmen or these smiths. They would be familiar with iron. They would know what to do. So, yeah. It's not like super important, again, like who they are, but there's significance in the metaphor nonetheless. And honestly, there's truth in both metaphors, regardless of what exactly was actually in the vision that Zechariah saw. There is truth in both metaphors. So, anyway, so putting the second vision together, God is going to bring about a total reversal of the present struggle, wherein those nations who have overstepped the line or overstepped the boundary of, the sort of God-ordained judgment against Judah will be cast out, right? What are these coming to do? Verse 21, these were the horns that scattered Judah, so that no one could lift up his head. But the craftsmen are coming to terrify them, to cast out the horns of the nations that lift up their horn against the land of Judah to scatter it, right? So present struggle, and then the reversal of that present struggle. So anyway, and again, that sort of fits with verse 1, because verse 1 is sort of the same thing. You have the present struggle wherein, verse 12, God is angry these 70 years. And then you get to verse 17, it's sort of the reversal of that, in which God says, well, I will again comfort you and I will again choose Jerusalem. So anyway, that's the first two visions. And like I said, yeah, I don't plan ahead for this. You know this. I don't know how we're going to do this, if I'm going to try to just do one chapter at a time or what. I mean, some of these chapters are like 10 verses, so we might try to double down on some of this, but we'll see. I got a whole 2 weeks to decide, because I don't think we got anything next week, do we? Because it's Thanksgiving, right?
Oh, yeah. Not for Thanksgiving, we won't.
Yeah, so I got 2 whole weeks to decide how I want to do this. So anyway. All right. Any questions on the second vision? Don't want to leave anything out. All right. In that case, we'll do prayer time.